Um, okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second round of global communication. And this is a joint project in collaboration with the University of Vienna and the Institute for International Communication at College of Professional Studies at St. John's University. And I'm delighted to introduce you to our Dean, Dr. Glenn Gerstner. And please, I know that he has to go for another meeting, so please take the floor.
Thank you, Basilio. I'm learning, I've only been interim dean since May, but I'm learning that I have meetings to go to. I'm actually running another meeting, our advisory board. So I apologize for talking and running, okay? I want to thank all of you for coming here today. You know, we have panelists from as close as Hofstra and as Fordham to as far away as Vienna. And of course, I have to thank Basilio, because I suspect that most of you are here because he asked you to show up, myself included. That's the reason that I'm here today. And if I could just see Kara, I see you here from Hofstra. Hofstra holds a place in my heart. I did my MBA there. And your longtime provost, Herman Berliner, is one of my best friends. He's my professional mentor. And I would say, if not for him, I wouldn't be sitting here today talking to all of you. So I'm a big fan of Hofstra. You know, this topic today could not be more timely. I went to my mailbox yesterday, my physical mailbox, and I put down on my kitchen counter 2 flyers. It was for a state assemblyman. One said, "He will work for you." And it had a picture of him with his family with a flag behind him. Okay. The other one said, "He's unfit to serve." And accompanied by some horrible Photoshop picture, the most unflattering picture we could find. So I started wondering, and I think we all wonder this at one time or another, does all this negative advertising cancel each other out? And the point is, it doesn't matter, it's going to happen. You know, my original academic training was in economics. And if you know anything about game theory, you know, the famous global thermonuclear war game, the equilibrium is both sides will arm themselves as much as possible. And that's because they don't trust the other side to disarm. It seems to me it's the same thing with political advertising. Both sides are going to take every last resource they have and try and throw it up against the opposition because they don't trust the opposition to have some sort of a truce. So as my mailbox fills up with all of these advertisements that I tend to throw out, and I can't even watch a baseball game for 5 minutes without being blitzed by some local advertising for a politician, I think this is a really good time to have this discussion about civility in politics. And now, as I said, I have another meeting to run to, which I actually have to run. I suppose, as I say in class, nothing happens till I get there. So that'll happen now. Basilio and all the panelists and everybody here, thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed the program.
Thank you so much. Very nice.
Thank you, Dean Gerstner. And I'm delighted to welcome once again. We have an audience from different parts of the world, all the way from Vietnam to Brazil to Jordan, Dubai, England, many European countries, and India as well. And so, and of course, from the United States too. So delighted to see this, in fact, becoming a global conversation. Now, quickly, let me introduce you to our speakers, to our panelists today. They all come with a very impressive background, which makes them very suitable to have this conversation, this difficult but important conversation. Barbara Triomfi is the executive director at the Vienna-based International Press Institute. It is a global network of editors, media executives, leading journalists dedicated to safeguarding and fostering media freedom and promoting quality independent journalism. Barbara has been with IPI since 2000, and she's a big advocate of press freedom. She has worked in Asia Pacific region, and she has kind of a very global perspective. And she also teaches at Vienna in the areas of media ethics, media literacy, cultural diversity, and the media. And her expertise, as I said, is in the press freedom, freedom of expression, and including self-regulatory media accountability systems, safety of journalists, and international mechanisms to protect press freedom. I'm also delighted to introduce to you Nana Walza. Nana Walza, she did her doctoral studies in communication at University of Vienna. In fact, under the mentorship of Professor Bauer, who is one of our moderators. And she's very present in European Union in the area of particularly area of promoting civility in communication. In fact, she's the co-founder and president of an NGO called Europe United. It's an organization for human Europe. And her books, she's been written, I'm not going to give you the German titles because I don't want to mangle my little German that I know. But in English translation is The Evolution of Humanity. There's one book that she has, and she also co-authored another book, Open-Minded Leadership. And now she's just published another one, Education of Humanity. And that is a series of two, Education of Humanity for young people and for adults. And I think her book that is coming out very soon is very interesting, The Bright Side of Power. So she's very prolific in the area of European and democracy and political education. And she has her own video podcasts called Europa Gefühlschaft. And she received, in fact, recently 2 Comenius Awards for her programs. And she's also engages in another program called Europa Cafe. So she has her own organization, Center of Applied Communication, where she trains and develops individuals, teams, organizations, institutions in different fields of communication and personal development, leadership, and change management, positioning, and strategy. I'm pleased to introduce to you my friend Kara Leimer. She is a professor of public relations at Hofstra University. She is the author of a very interesting book, Pitch, Tweet, or Engage on the Street, How to Practice Global Public Relations and Strategic Communication, which explains how to adapt public relations strategies for different countries and cultures. Her research interests include international and political public relations. She previously served as a communicator in the administration of US President Barack Obama and also at the United Nations. She writes op-eds for CNN Opinion and Bloomberg Opinion. And her research is published in academic journals, including International Journal of Communication, Journal of Communication Management, Journal of Public Affairs, Social Media and Society, and case studies in strategic communication. And I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Elisabeth von Dren. She's a professor in our journalism program at Johns University. She's a prolific scholar of history of journalism. A few weeks ago, the American Journalism Historians Association awarded her 2020 Joseph McCain's research grant to support her ongoing research on the 20th century journalism and propaganda history. In fact, her project is titled A Story of Words with No Action, Propaganda, Peacemaking, and Publicity Campaigns at the Paris Peace Conference 1919 and 1920. I'm super delighted to introduce to you my professor. I was his student, Jack Phelan. Well, his name is John Phelan, but affectionately called Jack Phelan. And he's expert in media policy and communication ethics. He's a professor emeritus of politics and media at Fordham University. He's the founding director of Public Interest Communications graduate program. And also he's the founding director of McGannon Center for Ethics and Communications Research. I'm pleased to introduce you to our moderators, Nina Aslama Horowitz. She's a fellow of the Institute of International Communication at St. John's University. She did her doctoral studies at the University of Helsinki, and also at the Swedish School of Social Science in their research institute. Her specialty kind of can be summed up in the area of media activism and social change. She does a lot of work in the area of communication rights in the era of digital disruption. And she's particularly tied here with the Academy of Finland, and also big interest in areas of digital communities, media governance. So and she also quite involved in the Council of Europe, European Broadcasting Union, and also works with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. And I'm delighted to also introduce you to my colleague, my friend, Dr. Thomas Bauer. He's a professor emeritus of Department of Communication of University of Vienna. He's a prolific author, and I'm a little reluctant to say some of his books in German. I don't want to come across a little fool. But let me mention one book that he wrote. He co-wrote with his colleague at the University of Sao Paulo in English. It's all about me and you, designing media humanism. And his former students have not left him alone. He's always kept on his toes, and he's always willing to be available to reach out and continue to teach. The teacher in him has not retired. Same thing with my professor Phelan. He still teaches. He still sends us at least twice a week some prolific readings. And so I thank you all, and I hand over to my colleague Mina Horowitz.
Thank you. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be moderating such a wonderful and diverse group. Couple of things about our participation here. I would ask everybody who is not speaking mute, just that we all have the best possible audio experience. I hear a little bit of a background noise, so if you are not speaking and you are not muted, do so. Secondly, we want this session to be as interactive and collaborative as possible. As Dr. Monteiro or Basilio, we agreed we'll use first names here. Exactly. We're all friends. As he said, this is a sensitive and difficult topic, and we need contribution to try to unpack and tackle this issue. So please feel free, dear participants, to post questions, comments on the chat. Basilio will be monitoring the chat. He will be your voice. He will be inputting your input into the conversation at several points. We've received plenty of time for that. So the chat is yours. It's your forum. But without further ado, we agreed to be on first name basis. We also agreed that we'd start in alphabetical reverse order. So I would first love to invite Nana, Ms. Walzer, Nana, to tell us about your definition of civility. We have a wide range of experts here, but before we can really dive into how we can tackle the challenges for civility in political communication, what do we mean by civility? You're working with teams, you're working with the European Union politicians, high-level people. How do you approach civility from that perspective?
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here. It's a great honor also for me and a pleasure. And when I was starting writing this impulse, I asked myself what it might be that you want out there, you really, really want. And it might be answers to, or at least inspirations to 3 burning questions. And they are burning not only in America or in Europe, they threaten to burn down civility, leaving democracy, human rights, or rationality out in the wild to be mangled by autocratic and demagogic power gamblers. So, what are these 3 questions? And these are also my answers to the question of civility and how to deal with that difficult topic. Question number 1, why do politicians act the way they do, especially when it comes to uncivilized behavior? So this is the individual level. And here I will bring in a little bit of an idea about dark or bright leadership styles and personality traits. Second question, how comes that people resonate with such issues, with such emotions, that they follow, believe, trust, or even vote for emotionally immature, obviously irresponsible, or openly manipulative acting people? So there's a reason, of course, and I will try to shed a little light on that. This is the intersubjective level, the level between people, and authenticity I would like to introduce as key to credibility here on that level. And this is kind of a different view in that field. The third question is, what kind of society is the result of dark or light, bright leadership, and how to deal with such a divided, polarized public? We are now here having a kind of a social climate change also, that it's not only felt in social media. So this is the transsubjective level, and here comes mediated communication into play, and the societies kind of between regress and progress, and how to deal with these developments. There is some ideas about that. So this might be my introduction. It takes about 4.5 more minutes. I hope that is okay. Okay, let's dive into it. Let's begin at the core, at the individual level, and with the questions where political civility or uncivilized behavior originates, what signs it shows, and how to quickly detect it. And one way to explain the roots and describe characteristics of destructive personal behavior is the so-called dark triad. It's coming from psychology, circling about 3 personality traits, namely narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And just in a nutshell, to describe those 3, you might have some pictures about politicians in your head when you hear about it. Narcissism reveals itself in grandiosity, extreme pride, pure egotism, fantasies of unlimited success, and a massive lack of empathy. Machiavellianism comes with the tendency to manipulate and exploit others. An absence of morality and high level of self-interest, and psychopathy is characterized by antisocial behavior, impulsiveness, selfishness, and remorselessness. So here's in a nutshell, a description of uncivilized behavior here, and there is some dark traits in all of us. That's important to know. So we all have it in us, but it's a matter of how intense we are driven by them and how we are acting them out, how much we are acting them out. Time's too short to go in any detail in that, but there is a lot of study about that. What might be even more interesting is the other side of the coin. So is the bright triad, the bright personality traits. And this is also a kind of an antidote and a first lead on how to deal with dark leaders. So who can provide the feeling of security in an insecure world without selling out complexity of reality to illusions of simplicity? And it's, of course, the bright side of power. And just to give 3 topics to throw them into the discussion, and perhaps later is time to explain a little bit more about that. One is responsibility for oneself and others. The second trait is empathy, and the third is conscientiousness. And all 3 of them are signs for a more mature personality. And even if there might be some politicians displaying bright leadership out there, we still live in a world where trust in politicians and governance is declining, and democracies are under threat. So it's very important to understand why are people locking into dark leadership or bright leadership. And here is the second layer, the interpersonal interaction layer. The dark side is very seductive these days, and there are lots of studies. I will not repeat researching the success of, for example, right-wing populism. So we can talk about that later. It's a lot of research is done. I would like to highlight another point here, another aspect that makes the difference whether people believe a politician or not, and this is authenticity. Authenticity is a key for when it comes to credibility, and authenticity means the presentation of a message that convinces people. It means that an expressed emotion congruent with body language, tone of voice. Almost never mind the message. The message just has to be simple, strong, in line with the emotion. And the impression of authenticity marks the level of credibility these days, because authenticity is being confused with honesty, and honesty beats competence when it comes to sympathy. It's a very simple rule, and it explains a lot. A hard fact message, the rationality and probability of a message, is less important for a lot of people out there than the authentic impression of a message and its sender, displayed in a consequent alignment of all communicative channels. People expect politicians to lie, and at the same time they rely on their gut feeling as a source of trust. And here we can learn a lot, especially when it comes to behavior of bright leaders. On top of general distrust in politicians, people also don't know how to deal with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity that reality displays these days. So there's deep need for simplicity, clarity, safety, stability, as well as for emotional proximity. And dark leaders, unfortunately, fulfill those needs and provide orientation. But the effect of dark communication is stress, and this triggers anger, hate, and contempt. and in the end builds an atmosphere of negativity and distrust even more. And so people are not, of course, being manipulated by a lying press or elites, but they are emotionally manipulated by dark leaders. And this is the core point of my whole short little presentation, that we have to deal with that emotional manipulation. And now I just will directly jump to the third level, to the society level and the social climate. Since years and years, people and society live in a constantly alerted emotional state. They are pushed by a seemingly everlasting yet always accelerating processes of who knows where to, and stuck between the pressure of many layers of open questions concerning everyday life and the future. So crisis after crisis, climate, economy, migration, and so on, they have built up a very thick atmosphere of uncertainty. And here comes the core emotion. Uncertainty is the feeding ground, the fertilizer for fears and all the other developments. But uncertainty can be used to dominate or innovate, to separate or unite. As a matter of fact, uncertainty can be diverted in two directions, towards regress and progress. And this is a choice we have to take very consciously. And we have to lead people that they are able to take it for themselves in a conscious way. And the emotional manipulation by dark leaders creates individual and social regress by keeping up a high level of stress. Keep them scared. That's the dark motto. And on the other hand, the bright leader's motto might be lead from fear to trust. So we are living in a deeply divided society. It seems that emotions fight reasoning, fear fights trust, tendencies of regress and deconstruction fight with progress and constructive aims, fake news, alternative realities, and conspiracy theories fight with the displays of a complex reality. But in the end, and here is my final remark, it all boils down to the question of how we use this phase in history. Do we take the chance to create a conscious development towards empowerment and self-empowerment, individual and civic empowerment, or are people left alone with their unsolved emotions being fodder for dark leaders, forcing them into regress? And I'm very happy to talk about possible answers or angles to deal with that in practical ways when it comes to that a little bit later, how to get out of emotional manipulation in political communication. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nana. Wonderful. You already gave us an extremely useful framework to start to understand what we mean about civility, individual, interpersonal, and societal. And so much for us to follow on. I made so many notes. However, I think there is a clear link to Barbara. Miss Triomfi, Barbara, you look at this from the perspective of journalists who actually are dealing with all these different three levels when they are reporting. And just this brought to my mind some American news from last night. We had two town halls, one of them with Mr. Trump. And I've seen comments that say, what a wonderful journalist, what an expert journalist being able to interview Mr. Trump in such a sort of a assertive manner. The other side saying how uncivil of the journalist. How is the situation for journalists at this moment, where civility and uncivility meet in places where we've never seen them before, and when conversations have turned so polarized? How do you tackle with these different levels of civility and uncivility, and how do you define civility in journalism?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minna, and thanks to the organizers for having me here today. So maybe just a little bit about IPI. The organization I work with, IPI is a global network of editors and journalists, and so we work together, dedicated primarily to the defense of press freedom and promoting independent journalism. So we work constantly with journalists and editors around the world who ask themselves all the time exactly the question that we're trying to discuss, to which we're trying to give an answer today. How do we cover certain issues? How do we, how do we cover the Trumps? How do we interview the Trumps of this world, and so on? I don't know very much if it is about civility or incivility in this specific case. I think specifically in the case of yesterday's interview is just about very good journalism. I think journalists are here also to ask the difficult questions, not to be irreverent toward leaders who are, especially who are lying and to their audiences. So I think that yesterday was an excellent display of journalism. For years we have been discussing how to cover populist leaders, and just recently at the panel at the IPI World Congress a couple of weeks ago, Masha Gessen, who is, for those of you who don't know her, she's a Russian-American journalist and author, very critical mind, and she said there is no good way for the media to cover Donald Trump without contributing to the damage he's doing. And yet journalists need to cover this and many other political leaders who are similar to the American president in the way they communicate with their audiences. But let me add something that, if you want, increases the challenges that we are all and that journalism is facing in this period, which are the developments which have been brought about by the COVID-19 crisis. What we have seen throughout this crisis, and IPI has monitored it very closely, is on one hand, a great weakening of press freedom around the world, from Europe to North America to Asia, part of Africa as well, and so on. So weakening of press freedom standards, even in countries that we normally would describe as democracies. At the same time, we have seen a weakening of trust in the news media, which sounds absurd because these comments comes at a time when people are eager to receive the accurate and fact-based information. They feel their lives depend on their ability to access accurate information. So how are these two phenomena connected to each other? What we have seen at the right, as soon as the health crisis hit different countries, the first step that government took was to take control of the media message in many different ways. As I said, depending also on the level of democratic standards in the country. However, we have seen it as a global phenomenon. The government takes control of the media message by giving limited access to information to journalists, preventing journalists from being able to talk to doctors, to those who are on the front line of the health crisis, restriction on movement that were imposed as a consequence of the pandemic did not include exemptions for journalists. So journalists were not able to go out because they had to stick to lockdown. They had travel restrictions, and those who dared to breach these lockdown restrictions on the basis of the need to go out and collect the news, very often they were detained, ended up in prison, and so on. Additionally to all that, we have seen a rush to passing the so-called anti-fake news laws supposedly meant to fight disinformation, which seems to be the big concern at the moment, and yet used in many, many cases by those in power to clamp down on those who dare to criticize the official line on the health crisis. In the moment governments, when there is a major health crisis hitting their citizens, the moment governments take over the media message, it automatically generates distrust in the media. It feels as if government, in the moment there is a health crisis, would all become doctors because they feel they can do that better. So in the moment you don't, as a government representative, as a minister, tell the people, if you want accurate information, look in the news media, look at our public broadcasters and so on, but rather look at ways to have a direct communication with the citizens. This generates immense distrust in the news media. And of course, we have heard a lot about division in societies. The division which has brought to the point that people do not trust information, even if it is fact-based, excellently researched, but they don't trust information that is published in news media that they feel do not reflect their ideology. Just a couple of weeks ago, Sally Busby, who is the senior vice president and executive editor at the Associated Press, talking at the panel, at an IPI panel, she brought the example of the New York Times investigation into Donald Trump's tax return. And she said people in America are so polarized that they won't believe this incredible journalistic investigation just because it was brought out by the New York Times. So they just switch off. So this is the challenge that journalists face now, to how can we not only deliver information which is complex, but also how can we make sure that people understand this, what we are doing is professional journalism, is fact-based journalism, and the information that you're receiving is accurate. Is accurate. So while doing journalism, also they have to think about explaining to their audiences why this is all credible, how they came to that information. So this adds complexity to the journalistic profession at the moment. And maybe one final point, in many countries, journalists also feel that the mechanisms normally offered by journalism of holding leaders accountable for their actions are failing. So basically, journalists are exposing what should be damaging information for the government, for those in power, and yet nothing happens. Nothing, there is no follow-up to exposure of corruptions, of lying. Take Belarus as an example. 1,000 protesters went to the streets, and yet they posed no danger to the regime. But from the point of view of journalism, that is this sense that whatever you publish, whatever you reveal, it will not bring about change. So an immense level of frustration. I leave it there for now, and I look forward to some questions after. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. What a fascinating connection, trust and civility, and sort of civility supporting trust, but I mean some level of perhaps challenges to civility in order to build trust. It's fascinating. The Edelman report of the 2020, the Global Trust Report, says that the most trusted organizations definitely are not governments or the media, but actually, on the other hand, non-profits from ethical perspective, and then companies from the perspective of efficiency. And that, I think, it's an interesting result. These are those who we trust, companies to be effective, non-profits to be ethical. Are non-profits the only ethical guideline for us? Where are the ethics in civility? Who is deciding what is civil today? Who is setting the standards? Dr. Phelan, Jack, if I may, you are one of the leaders in thinking media and communication from the perspective of ethics, as well as in a global setting, and related to policy as well. What is your take on civility? What does civility mean from that perspective?
Unmute.
Dr. Phelan, you're muted.
You're muted. Okay.
What?
Okay. Now can talk. Yeah.
All right. I'm part of my microphone, I guess. What I wanted to say is this, that we have developed a culture of civility over deception. So in the old days, an example of a self-contradictory statement is, your check is in the mail. Now it's much more developed, and we say, your call is important to us. That's a sure sign that it's not important to them, right? And another one of a cliche is, we take very seriously. That's something that they don't take seriously, or they've made a terrible mistake, but we take it seriously. And finally, I would say this, years and years and years ago, and I can say that truthfully, we had a tremendous problem with the administration at my university, who hasn't, And the faculty were really up in arms. And it was a close friend of mine who was in the classics department, which was my original field. And he was really riled up. And there must have been 100 people in this hall. And he stood up, and the president of the university was there. And he said, "We demand an apology from the administration for what they've done to the faculty." And people applauded. And the president apologized. And afterwards, I came up to him. His name was Bob. I said, "Bob, why the hell did you ask for an apology? Because that's the one thing you will get that is useless. The president is a hero for apologizing, but he's got to do something about it." So it seems to me that we've developed, in good faith, various formulae, memes, and other ways of saying something that we don't mean. Everybody knows we don't mean it, but it's part of the game, and that is considered civil. If I'm really mad as hell, but I say to you, "Well, I take your problem quite seriously," then you're, in a way, you're satisfied at that level. So that's one thing. The second thing is this. Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House a long time ago and was famous old pol, played the old style politics, he used to say that, well, there's graft and there's honest graft. And I think he really summed it up, that there's a certain level of cheating, a certain level of incompetence that is expected, a certain level of insincerity that is masked very well by formulae of sincerity, and that's okay. But there's a sort of unspoken line that you don't want to cross, because it spoils everything. We really can't get along together, and we really must get along together. So an example is this, a couple of examples. When Lyndon Johnson in the primary was running against Jack Kennedy, he went to the Commodore Hotel, which was next to the Grand Central Station, to have local people in politics, local congressmen, local mayors, important mayor, the mayor of New York, and they came to see him. And one famous one came to see him, a very important guy, and Johnson is talking to him. And of course, Johnson, next to him, he has a gigantic bag full of cash. And he said, "Now, I know you'll help me. I know you believe in what I think." He said, "And of course, I want to help you." And there's that bag sitting next to him. So the honest graft man said, "Lyndon, I'd love to help you, and I know you're sincere, but I have to be honest with you. I already took from Jack, so I really don't want to take from you." Now, there's an honest politician, according to the rules of the game that are played by all of them, and they know that's how it works. Now, let's go to Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump, like Duterte, like Mr. Putin, like Mr. Orbán, and especially, I guess, Mr. Bolsonaro. As Masha Gessen said about Trump, believe him. He's gonna tell you what he's really going to do. You can trust him to do what he said he's going to do. Now, of course, many of the things that Trump has said haven't come true at all, and he obviously didn't mean them. We will have not only a good health program, we're going to have a beautiful health program. And of course, we have no health program coming from him. And people know that's sort of his level of honest graft. But he also says other things, like the deal with Iran was the worst deal in the history of the universe. Since the Big Bang, nothing has been worse than that deal, and I'm just getting out of it. And he did. And it's created a tremendous amount of damage as a result. But let's go to how the support that he has from the professional people who play the game very well. When, I don't know if you remember this, Trump ordered rockets to be fired onto Syria because Syria had attacked, I think it was a hospital or some civilian target, which of course they did all the time anyway. And he said, you can't get away with that. and he sent in these rockets, which blew the hell out of an airport, what do you call, landing field for these fighters that they were using. They were back in action the next day. But the reaction in the press in the United States was fabulous. That important men in government, important men in medicine, important men in media and everywhere else. What did they say, most of them, when he did that? They say, finally, Mr. Trump is acting like a real president. And then the professional liars moved into place, and they put him to the shade, because what they were saying, we must protect freedom wherever it is in danger. The United States is the only superpower left in the world, and it is our job to keep things honest and to keep things fair, because that's what we stand for in the world. And so we must have different camps. I'm thinking of how the Pentagon thinks about the world and how it's accepted, right? If any other country, China, Russia, they divided up the whole world, putting Antarctica, into commands, right? So suppose the Caribbean was the tropical sea command of the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Air Force. I think we'd be very upset by that, wouldn't we? But in a way, I guess we are being honest when we say this is our command. So what I want to get back to is, what do we require by civility? And I think what civility is, part of it is deceit. In other words, an agreed upon deceit. That's a lovely dress, dear. You look wonderful. That sort of thing. We expect that, and it keeps society going, and we understand it, and it's, as I said, part of playing the game. If you take acting, and we are obsessed with theater because of film, and especially now when many people are locked in. And what is the greatest praise you can heap upon an actor? He is so authentic. He's so honest. When he played this role, he was such an honest portrayal. So the better you are at fooling people, the more honest you are if you're an actor, because you're convincing. And I think that carries over into civility. So you just say, please, and I think that's the great harm and objection to somebody like Trump or Duterte, is probably a better Trump than Trump, and Bolsonaro is out trumping Trump in many ways, is that they don't say, you look good in that dress, dear. They say, what a nasty woman. I can't stand her. And they mean it. So they're authentic there, but they're authentic in a way that is bad. You certainly should try to push things a little bit easier. So I think the big problem we have, as I said in the beginning, is we all know what civility is instinctively. We all try to be civil with one another most of the time. But I think politicians abuse civility by practicing honest graft up to this day. When we go back to President Trump, in many ways, he's blown away some of the great deceits. He said going into Iraq was stupid and it was a terrible waste of money. Well, he could tell the truth at times, and it's recognized, but people are upset if they're trying to preserve the illusion and saying, look, we're all trying to do our best. Well, it depends. Yes, of course, but your best at what? What is your best, and what are you trying to be the best liar, be the best trickster? So what about journalists then in this role? I think the problem with journalism is that it is such an uneven group of people. You have superb journalists, George Pachter, Dexter Filkins, a number of others in all countries who really, as they say, speak truth to power and try to find out what's really going on. And most of them do not do daily work. They disappear for a while and they come back with a bag of facts and they present it in an extremely literate and persuasive manner, either in the film form, there's some wonderful documentarians and video reporters around the world, or in just very well written reports of various kinds and books of various kinds. That's the real stuff. The daily stuff follows a set of formulae, and we accept that because it's quick and we understand what it means. But the average person is not interested at all. They're not interested at all in journalism. Most people couldn't care less about journalism. But the thing that's bad about it, especially if you love somebody, the hatred is tough. If they wind up hating you, it's really tough. But worst of all is if they're utterly indifferent to you, and you just don't mean it. You might as well not be there. You're a cipher, and that's what journalism is to most people. They don't really care about it. They don't even understand it. And one of the things, most of us here are professors. It is heartbreaking. I've spent, it depends how old you are, but you have spent most of your life, or you will spend most of your life trying to reach young people who are going to be journalists and are going to understand things, and just ordinary students, trying to give them an understanding of how the media literacy and citizenship, how they go together. We try to do that. And then time goes on and you get this terrible feeling, which is correct, that most people don't care, and most people, I think, 90% of the Republicans that are left are so-called base. No matter what Trump says or does, terrific, because he's such an honest guy. By honest, they mean, and they've said it in the beginning, he says what we think. Well, if he says what we think, God help us all. It seems to me that that rings a bell. And with Duterte, with the rich people in the Philippines, who are few but very powerful, when he says, I'm going to kill all these drug addicts. There, I'm just going to kill them. I'll kill some with my own bare hands because I'm your leader. I'm here to protect you. They applaud. And he goes ahead and kills people. So the strong man is somebody who appeals to the top for one reason and to the bottom for another reason. And American politics, we say, oh, American politics is polarized. Well, is it polarized in a particularly bad way that it's never been polarized before? I'm not so sure. It's open, and in my view, when they say polarized, it's giving a pass to Trump and Newt Gingrich and all those other people who really are people who practice dishonest graft. And they just get prepared to make the same thing as, Biden, well, there's something going on with his son in Ukraine. They're all the same.
Thank you.
He's
Thank
my
you,
guy,
Dr. Phelan.
and this guy is the other fellow's guy. So that's my little speech for today. I see you want me to go away, and I will.
No, thank you. I just see a question already coming up from the chat, and this is just such a perfect bridge to Elizabeth, if I may, Elizabeth's specialty, which is history of journalism. Plus, Elizabeth is currently teaching the future journalist at St. John's. Do you see this challenge that Dr. Phelan was just explaining? That are we living in a very specific moment in history where all of a sudden we do not care about journalism as much as we used to? And how does that reflect with what you talk about with your students, and especially the civility in the field of journalism?
Yeah, good morning. Would you like to respond to the question that you posed, or should I guess, tail it towards the end of my talk?
I would love to hear from your perspective. What do you think civility is? And I think it ties perfectly to what Jack, Dr. Phelan, just said about sort of teaching journalism and teaching media literacy, which you are engaged in every day.
Yes, I'd love to speak about it. And I agree with you. It's a perfect bridge to what I prepare to talk about. So again, I'm Elizabeth Fondren. I'm an assistant professor here at St. John's. And thank you, Basilio, Minna, and Thomas for inviting me to join the panel. When you asked me to, I guess, define civility in relation to communication, I understand it as really the quality, but then also the ability to finding a middle ground. And I think the central question that this really topic poses to all of us as educators, as scholars, is to how can we emphasize and in a way restore this middle ground by using our tools, which are information, ideas, evidence, to trying to provide the most, I guess, broadest perspectives that we can, but always emphasizing those perspectives, of course, that are pro-democratic. So first, I think that as educators, as professors, we have a responsibility to share knowledge about how citizens and the public can find this middle ground. As I said, I think that this is by looking at different opinions, looking at international media, but as I said, keeping a clear focus on factual truth and fact. So this is the question of proportionality in journalism. I'd like to point out one of the quotes that I really value so much in my educational approach, which is sunlight is the best disinfectant. Justice Louis Brandeis wrote this at the beginning of the 20th century in Harper's Weekly. And he argued that publicity can support progressive causes, and it can also build media agendas that impact public affairs in a positive way. So secondly, I think the broader theme that I connect to civility are the values of truth, seeking truth, and educating people in analyzing untruth and falsehoods, which this of course includes propaganda analysis. And this leads me to my next point, where I draw on another philosopher that I respect so much, Hannah Arendt, the German-American political philosopher. She warned about the very moment when societies degrade all truth into meaningless triviality. In her 1960s,
today's a bitch. Today is a last. When are you gonna live together?
I think I hear some noise. Okay, so in her 1967 essay, which is called Truth and Politics, and was published in the New Yorker, Arendt wrote, "The story of the conflict between truth and politics is an old and complicated one." She writes that, really going back to Plato, the opposite of truth is opinion and often illusion. So third, from my, I guess, personal experience and also working in media, but also, observing, I guess, the political process, the bigger and really worrying theme that I see is both in the past and in the present, these discussions about, I guess, the integrity of the political process. And this means specifically a growing disregard for facts, the displacement of reason by emotion, a concerning level of cynicism and distrust. I think Nana spoke about this in the beginning of our conversation. So distrust against the press and the corrosion of political language. All of these factors are diminishing the value of truth as the basis for our decisions, and I'm really worried what that might mean for our information societies. Just this week, a nonpartisan group of academics and political communication experts called Media for Democracy released an interesting white paper, and I'll share the white paper with you in the chat. They outline best practices for how to cover this upcoming presidential election and also how to help prevent a repeat of the 2016 election coverage. As I said, I think that their effort is really an incredible example of how to share communication advice publicly so that the public and media practitioners can benefit from, knowledge that often is generated in the ivory tower, but, they take it further, they publish it. So one of advices they give is, something that we teach in the classroom, in our journalism classes, do not incite violence, do not, increase people and increase harm on people. So they say, do not give a platform to individuals or groups who call for violence, spread disinformation or racist ideas. And really to add to that, my own research in journalism history explores the historical underpinnings of how educators can help develop and share anti-propaganda efforts with a mass audience. So currently I'm working on a paper about the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, which was located here in New York at Columbia University. And really this group of scholars before and during World War II, to do is they tried to launch a widespread newsletter and magazine. They called it Propaganda Analysis. They called themselves Propagandists for Democracy. So they, tried to use publicity in a very, let's say, pro-democratic way. Their goal was to educate Americans about the dangers of political disinformation and also a public fatigue to engage with, messages that don't necessarily are pleasant. At their high point, they reached 5,000 subscribers at schools and universities all over the country. And so what I take away from this is that really between 1937 and 1941, this institute, through their publicity efforts, raised awareness and highlighted the need for information literacy. This initiative, of course, precedes our own modern attempts, right, to promote critical thinking and engagement with political information. The story, of course, is cut short of the IPA because their efforts stalled and were branded as unpatriotic by the US House of Representatives. And this was, of course, the historical context is that the US was attacked in December 1941, Pearl Harbor. And so everything that was, let's say, critical or even advancing analysis of information was seen as unpatriotic, un-American. And I think that this is something that we also see today, right? Politicians will use these two, let's say, phrases, you are unpatriotic, you are un-American, to stop analysis and critical engagement. So the lessons of this institute are that, promoting critical thinking and media literacy is really hard to do well. And that when societies become truly polarized or, are at the verge of, a world war, just teaching tolerance and critical thinking can become controversial. Mm-hmm. So as I really wrap up, I want to leave you with this question. When we think about how to educate for future journalists and, mass communicators about civility in this current political climate, how can we restore the dignity and also the meaningfulness of conversations about politics, but make sure to educate students and then ultimately the public about democratic ideas so that, really together we can advance those platforms or those publicity efforts that promote anti-propaganda, nonpartisan, truthful coverage, storylines, and also results. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That is a task. We know that media literacy efforts around the world are ongoing, yet not that successful. We're looking for that secret sauce for that. I think Dr. Phelan made an interesting point, though, about civility and authenticity. And if I think about Dr. Alaima Kara, your field, you are in the field of public relations, where authenticity is probably one of the key tools when you communicate messages. And at the same time, we're playing with this sort of what is civil and what is authentic and how that's shifting in today's world. How do you see civility, Kara?
Well, when I think about public relations, one of the big shifts in sort of the definition of public relations over the past couple of decades has been this new focus on two-way communication. And now there's really an understanding that excellent communication requires an organization to engage in two-way communication in which the organization itself is actually open to change as a result of the dialogue that it has. And too often, of course, we see organizations pretending to practice two-way communication when in reality they've sort of already made up their minds and are simply just trying to convince people of what they've already decided. And I think that you have much more of a chance of having a civil conversation if you're able to, in fact, be open to change as a result of what you learn. I think what we're finding is because of increased political polarization, which we've already discussed today, our conversations have become increasingly uncivil. And I do think that we can't be afraid to sort of call a spade, to use an American term, and be rather direct about the fact that a lot of this is coming from the top. I was looking back on a book that was just published called Words on Fire, The Power of Incendiary Language and How to Confront It by Helio Fred Garcia, who's actually a friend of mine. And he looked at President Trump's language, and he found that President Trump is in fact using language that was used just before the Holocaust and just before the genocide in Rwanda. And he argues that what President Trump has been doing is actually the equivalent of using a dog whistle. So if someone uses a dog whistle, that whistle is audible to a canine, but not to humans. And he says that President Trump kind of does something similar in his coded language, where he doesn't directly call for violence, but in fact, his followers recognize his language for what it is, which is an implicit call to violence. And Fred Garcia looks at how hate crimes have increased directly following this speech. So in the aftermath of President Trump's election, we know that there was an increase in hate crimes against particular groups that he had spoken of negatively during the campaign. And he says that actually President Trump's rhetoric has only gotten worse and become more incendiary over time. He's become more direct in discrediting political rivals rather than indirect. And also the number of lies that President Trump has said has increased dramatically over time. And so clearly this is something that's coming from the top, but clearly the problem of political polarization is much broader. And Eli Pariser talks about how now we live in filter bubbles where increasingly we are not exposed to people who have different views than we have. Minna already mentioned the competing town halls last night. And I sort of can't emphasize strongly enough what an irresponsible decision I think it was on the part of NBC to schedule the town hall with President Trump at the exact same time as ABC had already announced that they were doing a town hall with Vice President Biden, because the debate was originally scheduled to happen in that time slot and was then canceled when President Trump refused to participate. But I think, it's sort of a prime example of how Americans had to decide who they were going to support and who they were going to watch, rather than listening to both sides, which might have promoted greater understanding, which could lead to civility. One of the things that I've written about extensively in my op-eds for CNN and Bloomberg is social media and the conversations that happen on social media. And I think what's interesting is that we've obviously been noticing for a long time that those of us who are on Facebook are old now, right? And a lot of young people have been leaving Facebook for other platforms for a long time. And I think certainly the conventional wisdom, but I also think what scholars were arguing for a long time was that young people were leaving Facebook because they didn't want to be on the same platform as their parents. And I think a lot of people are starting to reconsider that now and realizing that it may have been sparked by politics and actually been political. And so what we're seeing now is that Twitter is more liberal. Facebook has become more conservative. And so the most shared posts each day on Facebook are conservative. Top content on Twitter is liberal. And already we know that people are friends with people who largely have the same political views as them on Facebook. But I think if now we find liberals and conservatives fracturing and splintering onto different social media platforms, things are only going to get worse because there's no chance of talking to one another and understanding one another in civil conversations, which of course would promote broader civility in our society. And the reason this is really a huge problem is because research tells us that when like-minded people get together, they often end up thinking a more extreme version of what they thought before they started to talk to one another. So this suggests that things could really only get worse if this trend continues. I've become particularly worried about this trend and wrote a piece for CNN about it after the Biden campaign launched a petition against Facebook. I actually agree, and I signed that petition, but I think the danger is if liberals all start leaving Facebook, things are only going to get worse and therefore more uncivil. And I'd end by saying that this is a topic that's personal to me because I receive a lot of hate mail for the op-eds that I write. I've received death threats and filed police reports as a result of some of those emails. That in particular, women tend to be targeted. In her book, Hate Crimes in Cyberspace, Danielle Keats-Citron says that 70% of online harassment is targeted at women. Of course, we know women of color are targeted disproportionately and experience even more of this. But I actually wrote an entire column about my hate mail that I get for my columns. I wrote this piece for Bloomberg a couple of years ago now. And one of the things I talked about was just how misogynistic these emails are. Obviously, we can't tell someone's gender from the name that they choose to put on their email, but I have noted that the names that people put on their emails when they send me hate mail almost always tend to be traditionally male names and tend to use language that's used especially to target women. And I found that to be especially, I think, threatening. But, this idea that I'm not entitled to my opinions because I'm female and that my gender somehow allows people to communicate with such incivility towards me. And so I'm really worried that we can no longer have civil conversations, certainly in my country of the United States.
Thank you, Cara. You actually addressed, of course, several issues that, for instance, Barbara had addressed, and I think, Barbara, you probably know a lot more about the statistics, how women journalists are targeted in many ways. But you also addressed, Cara, an important point that I see in the chat that Tilia was asking about. How do you all see changes in the essence of civility taking place in the way people use social media, and what kind of those changes have been? And of course, this is a topic that is much talked about right now. That is has said to let the sort of demise of expertise, sort of the authority of traditional expertise, be it government, be it science, and so on and so forth, is now changing due to the fact that all of us are experts. So how do you see that social media, and us all being able to be experts and tell Cara that she doesn't know what she's talking about, and send hate mail anonymously to anybody we don't like, how has that changed the way we understand civility? Nana, do you want to start?
That's a very interesting question. Again, I start with emotions. I think people start to get uncivilized when their emotional preset is not met. And of course, when their prejudgments are not met. So the question is, again, an emotional. If people did not learn how to deal with emotions by themselves, they are left with the classical stress reactions like fight, flight, or ignorance, shock, doing nothing. So those who are tending to be aggressive when they feel helpless, or when they get under threat, or feel their worldviews in danger, yes, they start to get aggressive and they have to act it out. So they are just signs of people who are not in a developed personality state. So what we need, and this would have been some of my ideas how to address the crisis of society on an individual level, in this case, would be more developed individuals, for example, by educating them in schools. I wrote a curriculum for, education of humanity in schools, so that people learn how to deal with difficult emotions themselves, and they don't have to act them out just to have the feeling they are under control again. They don't feel threatened by criticism so much. It's a classical, frustration tolerance topic, and they have to learn to understand reality is ambiguous. It's very difficult. It needs a ripe, emotional and a mental state. We have to help them to get there. And I can talk a lot more about how we could achieve that, not only through education, but also role modeling and so on. Perhaps we have later the time.
We'll definitely make time for that, Nana. That is really important. And you made me think about the connection that when we look at resilience to disinformation, for instance, and uncivility, if you like, it's media starting already from the basic educational level and then going throughout your educational career. And the second one is press freedom. And Barbara, you had been talking about how press freedom is really challenged in a way that we haven't seen in decades and decades. Do you see social media having an effect on that?
Thank you, Mina. Yeah, no, indeed, there is a great concern about what's happening on social media in terms of both the type of communication that goes on there and the type of information that is shared through social media. Basically, bottom line is the lack of gatekeepers there is what.
I think we lost Barbara for a second.
Can you hear me?
Oh, you're back. You're back.
I was after it. So I was talking about the lack of gatekeepers on the social media, which generate this concern. But 2 points I wanted to make at this regard. On one hand, when we see this call for stronger regulation of the social media, even censorship, if you want, like removing content and all of that, which partially I may agree with, of course, but let's not forget that social media remain in many places around the world the only space available to those who want to criticize those in power or who want to express opinions which are different from that differ from the government. So we need to still. This has still an immense value. The second point that I would like to make, our research, IPI has done a lot of work to research specific attacks against journalists that take place through social media channels. And as Kara said already, of course, we know the great majority targets women or representative of minorities. In the case of journalists, not because women and representative of minorities do different things in journalism, just because it's easy to target them, because the misogyny, the racism that exists in society is being exploited, and to make these messages viral. However, what our research has also shown is that a lot of it is generated by organized campaigns. So it's not viral in the first place. It's not that there are people out there on the street hate us and that's why they send messages. Many of the messages that we all and journalists receive, messages of hate, are generated, first of all, are coordinated by somebody in a position of power who wants to challenge the credibility, the trust, and silence an individual. But they are also generated by bots, by paid aggressors, trolls, and so on. So Kara was talking about the name of the person who is behind. In the end, in many, many cases, and I know a lot of people who are targeted also they want to know more. Why is this person so much against me? Why you? You know, people were saying, why are women now attacking me with sexual-based attacks? But very often these are, as I said, these are bots, these are paid aggressors, these are is an organized things. So to which extent does this reflect the type of civil or uncivil communication that is out there in society? Of course, it legitimizes, if you want. If we see a lot of this, we think now we can, as this legitimizes attacks and all of that. But on the other hand, we need to keep in mind, it's not, it does not come from the bottom. It very often comes from the top, from the centralized place.
There is a There's a question for Nana from Wayne Robbins. He says, would Nana say that one of the skills of the dark leader is the ability to fake authenticity? How does a journalist reveal the false authenticity of the dark leader?
I think the point is not that they fake authenticity, but they show their real people, like most civilized people, is they try to hide their feelings and act rational. And this may give the impression of being not authentic. I hope this was kind of a question, an answer to the question.
There is a comment, I think probably addressed with Professor Phelan, comes under your kind of expertise. The comment is, I'm going to read a comment coming from Marianne Mead from UK. It says, Fauci versus Trump seems to illustrate the difference between the impartiality of science and the vested interest of financial and or political interest. If there is a difference, the medical journals have peer reviewers, whereas the press is presently in the hands of big capital that employs journalists whose very existence depends on satisfying the employers. This suggests major conflicts of interest between personal survival and the benefit of the public. My non-expert perception is that investigative journalism is closer to the ethics of medical research and practice than the populist press. I'm not naive enough not to recognize some tendencies even in the medical world, but it is not quite so obvious than in the general press. Anyone would like to comment? I would like to invite Professor Phelan.
I think he stepped out for a moment. Elizabeth, as a professor of journalism, how do you see this question? Commercial media versus non-commercial.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not an expert in, I guess, the business model of journalism, but I can speak a little bit about, I guess, the truth proposition that we have both in, empirical science and then also journalism. I think the question was about investigative journalism in particular, and I would agree that, investigative journalists, they are not, they should not be interested in what they are going to find. So the outcome is unclear, right? It's undefined. So the process or the method of reporting is really just as important, and that it is transparent as really what they are going to find. So in a way, what I, work with when I guess, direct students in writing their own stories, say, you can have an idea or a hypothesis of what you might find, but be prepared that, those perspectives or the dimensions might change. So you cannot start from, if we take a political message, right, the outcome of, or the objective is very clear. But if we take journalism as a process, is really just as important as what will be found and then, I guess, shared with the public. So I think that in a way, comparison between medical science as based on empirical evidence and then also journalism, which I'm seeing, or at least in Germany, my home country, some of the, or one of the big weekly papers, Die Zeit, tested, tried to test how audiences would react if, Die Zeit journalists would provide footnotes to their articles. So that's, I think, in a way, an attempt to, substantiate reporting with this added layer of transparency here. Reader, we are not just arguing this. This is where you can find the facts. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You indeed did. That is so very interesting, because in studies on trust and journalism, we hear again and again from news audiences, for instance, that transparency of journalistic practices is one of the key building blocks of building trust in this situation. And so maybe transparency is one of the solutions. And that's why I would like to open the question for all the panelists now. How can we start to find some solutions, and how can we start to sort of explicitly define this this issue of civility that Jack Phelan, Dr. Phelan, so well put it, that it is implicit and we kind of know instinctively what it is. But it seems to me that one of the challenges is that we are not addressing it explicitly, and we really do not set standards, if you like. So can we set standards? Who could set standards? Who could monitor civility? Of course, for journalism, we do have all kinds of media organizations or watchdogs to monitor the legal issues of civility and libel and so on and so forth. But can we even start to mend this? And what would be the means? Kara? This very easy question. I'll hand it to you immediately.
I can only suggest one very tiny piece of this when it comes to social media, but you mentioned some organizations that can set standards, and I do think that we should be counting on social networks to set better standards. One possibility would be to require that people use their real identities online. Currently, Facebook says that you need to use your real identity. I don't know how well it's actually enforced, but that's not the case on Twitter. And I really, when I come back to it, I think one of the reasons why people are able to be so uncivil on social media in particular is because you're not seeing the person. I suspect that some of the men who send me hate mail would say these things to my face, but others probably wouldn't, right? Because it would violate their sense of decorum. And so I think that one small aspect of the solution is humanizing people on social media. And I think that using your real identities could be sort of one part of that.
Thank you. Nana, what do you think? In addition to making the platforms accountable and making us all not anonymous, what could we do?
I think the personal approach is a very sensible one, but still it needs people who can deal with their own predispositions. So my approach would be an approach of development by three means: on the individual level, on the interpersonal level, and on the transsubjective level. And I would like to give some examples how that could work, how people could be helped in doing the transformation work themselves from uncertainty or fear to trust. And one of it is it could be even in the presidential, in the election debates. Yes, it's role modeling by politicians. So if I would see Mr. Biden, being deeply affected, showing some real emotion, and then talking about it, including it in meta communication. So this is hurting because of, and you're behaving in an immature way. So let me try to find out where's the honesty, where's the root for my honest affection now, and let me deal with it in a solution-oriented way. So he can take, during a debate, the people from a highly affected mode to the next more neutral emotional ground by talking about it, and from there to a more fact-based field, what is the problem behind it, and in the end to a reasonable solution-oriented, opening up a discussion field. So I think it needs a lot of role modeling to give people the chance to understand how this works, how to deal with negative emotions or with affection. This also could work in schools, like I said, a personal development, something that is not happening yet in schools. We know about the positive effects of meditation in schools, for example, but this is only a very few part of it. I could talk along about that. But the third thing I would like to refer to is the mediated level. And I think how to say that? It's not about, standards in a way that people have to behave by modelings that they learn. It's not about, behavioral standards, but it's about learning that for themselves, that there is a reality, The issues is education of humanity, and media could show that by taking responsibility for the emotional impact of their news, for example. They don't do that. They try to give an impression of objectivity or neutrality by showing, for example, catastrophes or awful, reporting about things Mr. Trump said, but they are not addressing the emotional part. And I think this could be a solution that almost no one thinks about. What is doing this to people when people read it or hear it? What are the honest emotions and how to deal with them? And is a possibility to address them, to do again some meta communication, and to do some empowerment work, so opening up possibilities, how to understand those complexities behind, to deal with it, so that people are left with some concrete, relevant solution for themselves. This is, by the way, what we try to do with our audio podcast, Europa Gefühlsecht. Thank you. Some ideas.
Thank you. We have to check that out. Barbara, do you think that rings true? Do you think the approach with emotions is one way, and what could be some other ways to start to tackle the situation of uncivility?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, no, of course, I fully agree. And I also would like to bring maybe an example that comes again from the news industry. It refers to how, uncivil behavior does not only take place on social media, but it would in theory, or does take place as well on the comment pages of news organizations. So what news media have done, quality news media obviously have done in recent years, is to increase their resources dedicated to moderating that conversations by reducing the censorship, if you want, the removal of comments as much as possible. So the principle is, of course, allow participation, also because news organizations need community. They need this level of participation for many reasons. So allow participation and yet moderate it in a way that the conversation is civil, if you want, in the context of this discussion, but certainly contributes to the relevance in terms of the public relevance, and it requires major resources, and it requires also some time when somebody makes a comment that we would define as uncivil, but yet does not reach the level of having to be removed immediately. Encouraging others to react against it, so that in the end people are encouraged to not support this type of behavior in that community, in that context. So I think that what some news organizations have done is impressive. I would not trust the platforms to do that themselves, but in some cases they have handed over some of their tasks to news organizations who know how to do this, and I think that's a much better solution. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Chat Dr. Phelan, what is your solution? What can we do? I think you're muted, so I'll mute the mic. Your mic is muted, Dr. Oh, there we go.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said. You can hear me now. Yes, but I can't hear you. No, I just heard you. Do you hear me? Yes, well, in order to establish civility, we must hear one another, I guess. That's the first thing. Many attempts for a long time to establish standards and ethics have been done by trade associations, and my PhD was on film censorship, and I spent, what else would a graduate student do? I spent a lot of time in Hollywood researching this thing, and I was a fly on the wall for about, I guess, 3 months in the office of, what do they call it? They had the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA, had developed their own office of, in broadcasting, they call it standards and practices. In film, they had another term for it. But in any event, what I learned from this is that everything in the organizational world, in the trade organization world, which is the level at which this is approached in the so-called real world, is in these trade associations. And they have some clout. It depends on what the Associated Chamber of Commerce has a good clout. Everybody has a code. And as somebody said, probably the most beautiful constitution in the world is the Russian Constitution. If you read it, it's an amazing tribute to freedom and Enlightenment values and everything else. It's just up there on the wall, and nobody deals with it. Let me get back to Hollywood. What I learned there was that they react to complaints. In fact, the original code for films was simply called lists. It was a list of don't and a list of be careful. And they just enforced these things. And why did they do that? They did it for business purposes, because the United States, many different kinds of societies and cultures within the United States, and they were being nibbled to death by minnows. They'd make a movie, and somebody in Chicago would say, "This we can't see. This is terribly insulting," and they'd have some complaint about it. And so they changed that, and they send the movie out again. And then somebody in New York or somebody in Minnesota, they all have these different complaints, and they boycott the film. So they invented the production code. That's what it was called. They invented the production code, and it was meant to be the production code. You have to get back before you even get on the screen to have these rules. And they had people on the set who used to have script girls, of course, they called them. But they also had people who were observers from the production code. And when they would be shooting, they'd interrupt. They had great power to do it. They'd say, "Stop, cut. What's wrong?" When a man and a woman are in bed together, 1 foot of the man was always be on the floor. So they had these mechanical rules that if they did this, they wouldn't get in trouble. Never show a picture of the inside of a woman's thigh. Rather quaint these days, considering what they do. But it was all these little rules. Now, if we try to establish standards in a codified manner, it will be up there on the wall. I think what you have to do is, to use an old-fashioned term, is you have to set the tone. And the thing that sets the tone, and tone, of course, is an amorphous thing, but we all know what it is. If you're in certain restaurants, you can speak at a certain volume, and in other restaurants, you don't. And in certain restaurants, the waiter acts in a certain way, and in others, he doesn't, because they have a mini culture or a micro culture in that restaurant. And frequently, that's why people do go to restaurants, to be with those who understand them. And so we have to establish that tone. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's incredibly difficult and never will be accomplished. But it seems to me that you have to require it of political leaders, so that in a way you've got to react to them. So when they do, they get booed. You should boo them when they lie to you. I don't say you throw eggs at them, but there has to be some sort of incivility on the part of people who are being truly insulted in their intelligence or in their morals by the way people talk to them. And if you look at the way different leaders talk to people, frequently it's patronizing, frequently it's very smooth but meaningless, and other times it's deliberately insulting. So there has to be, what shall we call it, a authentically outraged audience to set the tone. Now, this will be accomplished in some places here and there, now and then, but I think that's the best you can be hope for. But it's an incredibly pluralistic world. We have so many different media that are targeted to definite cultures, just like the different restaurants. And you can't expect to say we must set standard for the media. You can't, because media is a plural. You can set a standard at certain times for a certain period, for certain things, and that requires all politics is local. So all civility is also local. And I mentioned I was connected with the, in some sort of peripheral manner, with the United Nations. And I thought they did rather well in codifying a certain amount of diplomatic hypocrisy, that they were able to, they had this marvelous way of describing really bad things in a very antiseptic way, and they still do it. Now, you say, isn't that terrible? Why don't they get realistic? because the meetings would break up if they didn't go that way. And I have been able to accomplish over, what is it, I don't know, 60, 70 years, a certain amount of civility and practice of civility. And at least this, that up until recently, tyrants would try to make believe they weren't tyrants, at least. And hypocrisy, of course, is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. So I think what we have to try to do is set a tone. And when I say we, I mean the local audience that you're in. If you're in a Twitter following or something like that, try to set the tone there. If the tone is hate, that's what will prevail. So I guess it's expectation of behavior is what makes us behave. And you've nodded yes to everything I said, so I'm very grateful to you, Minna. Anyway, if there are any criticisms or want to argue about something, I'm open to being argued at.
I would not argue with you. I think you made an important point that while we think about different fields and institutions, and this actually sort of this is a full circle to Nana's first comment, it has to do with us as individuals as well and our interpersonal connections. We can't blame journalism alone. We can't blame the individual governments alone. I would like now, though, to give the last word and the last commentary to Dr. Bauer. Thomas, what is your take on our conversation today?
Thank you very much, Minna. I mean, it was a very interesting discussion and a conversation with very different approaches. Really interesting. What I would like to comment to 3 points following this discussion and bringing it somehow into, let me say, a scientific framing, because we are here in order also to know why do we think on communication and on civility as we think, and why do we think civility is so important for political communication. So I think we have to ask what do we mean by political communication? And I think it's not just the exchange of information or of narration or opinion between politicians and people transmitted or transported by media, or even vice versa. I think we have to widen the concept of political communication. It's widespread, is a widespread sphere of everyday discourse related to topics, to themes, or to events of public or political interest, at least on 3 levels: on a media discourse level, on a milieu affiliated level, and on an everyday level. Of course, as we live in a media society, what means that the society happens in the modus of use of media. Also, our politically relevant communication happens in structures, in culture, in rituals, in codes, and mainly in dramaturgy of media. As we are living with a hybrid media landscape, of course, as we are living in a media society, what means the society happens in the modus, we have to think about that. And as we are living with a hybrid media landscape, classical and social media, we experience at least 2 different media communication orders. The more vertical structured order of classical and traditional media, and the more horizontally built order of new and so-called social media. The vertical media order is more or less built on a systems mechanism of trust by organization, management, systemization, and professionalism, while the horizontal media order is more or less built on an instant and situational social mechanism of trust and credibility because of spontaneity and authenticity of interaction. I think both orders interfere to each other in terms of norms, in terms of experience, and in terms of practice. In both spheres of social order, personality, charisma, or prominence, keeping the rules or breaking the rules, draw attention, mostly understood as a news factor. Anyway, attention is the currency of media society. In social media environment, as it gives more space for casuality, for individuality, those people draw attention that break the rules as a statement of individuality. We have been talking about Trump, as a statement of sovereignty, and as a statement of liberation, or maybe even emancipation, breaking the rules of rationality or reasonability of social communication, what we think was civility. So the second point then is civility. Civility is a concept of rationality and reasonability of social attention and social behavior, and last but not least of truth. Was talking about Elizabeth. Not firstly a moral concept, but an ethical one, saying communication is a source of sense and making sense. And it makes sense if it is useful, means beneficially, helpful, profitable. If it is aesthetical, means sensually observable, sensually acceptable, enlightening the horizon of the perception. And third, ethical means based, determined, and identified by socially moral motivation. And those three levels are interfering each another. Of course, they are depending from each other. Nothing is useful if it is not ethical. Nothing is useful if it is not aesthetical. Nothing is aesthetical if it is not useful or ethical. And nothing is ethical if it is not useful and aesthetical. So civility is a content as well as a competence status of education, and trying to define education, meaning a character of personality that is able, capable, and aware of responsibility of and for a mindful and a meaningful relation towards the natural, the social, the cultural, and the symbolic environment, based, of course, on knowledge, on experience, on consciousness, and on reflection. It is a value category of social competence. All that is conceptualized in the term of political reason. Educationally spoken, of political literacy, including, of course, media literacy and communication competence, as we have spoken about. So I'm coming to the third point. Because I have not yet mentioned the category of humanists and humanists, but I should, of course. In case we understand communication as the resource of constructing reality and relevance for what we are able, willing, and desiring to live with, spoken as a communication scientist, of course, we maybe should perform more than we do. The shift of paradigm from a functional understanding of media and communication to a more philosophical and anthropological interpretation of communication, especially in political context, in order to favor or to give priority to humanity and humanists of a social communication before its technological or economic function, profit, or efficiency. That would also mean, of course, maybe we should conceptualize the spheres of politics as well as communication as scientists closer to the values and to the horizons, bright sides, as Nana said, of humanity than to values of interests of economy, system logics, or strategies of power and influence. Thus, a scientist, we would not contribute to science as a source of power, but to science as a reason of responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, all good things have to come to an end. And so I really appreciate and thank you. I'm grateful for all our panelists and for joining us, giving us your time, your knowledge and your experience and sharing with us. And we remain very grateful, and I'm sure our lives have become much more enriched. Thank you very much, Mina, for moderating, and Thomas for putting the cap on. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful
Basilio.
Bye. Thank you.
Hey, Monica, see you. So it was wonderful to see you. Tilia, it's good to see you. Everybody. So, okay, I'll be in touch. Thanks, Jack, for being part of this experiment. So there will be a second round. I think Razan will be joining us in a third round. So
I'm scared when you say I'm part of an experiment. Pleasure. I enjoyed it, and it was really very nice to meet all these people all over the world, and so eloquent, but mostly they set the tone. They're very authentic, and I mean it.
They are very authentic, and they have the tone. Oh, it's good. So thank you. So we'll get to our next round. Okay. Special thanks to Christina. Christine, thank you. Thank you very much. Cara, thank you so much for making the arrangement.
My pleasure.
The babysitting and everything I had to do. So, Christine, thank you so much.
No problem. It went great.
Yeah, thank you. So.
Thank you, Dr. Basilio, for the great conversation. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Professor, and everybody. It was really interesting today and very up to date. Yeah, and I'm excited to join in the next conversation soon.
Yes, there will be a round 3.
Round 3.
Helene, how are you? Helene is joining us all the way from Uganda.
Yes, thank you. This was very, very good. It was so interesting, and I have a lot of questions, but I think I will ask you, Dr. Monteiro, after.
Helene was my student, and now she's a diplomat, Swedish diplomat in Uganda.
Yeah, this was a fantastic webinar, indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we'll see you soon, everybody. Thank you, Professor.
See you soon. Okay.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
I'm ending the meeting, Christina, okay? Okay.
Yeah.